Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. We humans like to be right about things. As you'll hear in this episode, our self-image and our perception of being trustworthy to others can feel threatened when our thinking is questioned. After all, within our own brains, our thought processes make perfect sense, at least to us. So how could we be wrong? And outside of our own brains, we've all had the painful experience of failing to sway someone's opinion, even when the facts and data are clearly on our side. Why are minds so difficult to change? What are the cognitive biases that may get in the way of us thinking something through? And how can we override these tendencies to make better decisions and live fuller lives? Fortunately, I know just the guy to ask. David McRaney is a journalist, a self-described psychology nerd, and a self-delusion expert. He has written many books describing how our brains work and how they don't, including his best-selling book with a super cheeky title, You Are Not So Smart. His most recent book, How Minds Change, is a very important contribution to psychology, and I am not alone in my high regard for David. Publishers Weekly writes, McRaney makes a convincing case and backs it up with what science has to say about replacing old ignorance with new wisdom. So listen in as David and I talk about how minds change. David McRaney, welcome to Super Psyched.
Hey, thank you so much.
So, first piece, I read a lot of books, at least 2 on Audible every week. And in the last 10 years, possibly one of the most important books I've read is How Minds Change. This is such a crucial book for everyone, especially during these times. It describes the soup we're swimming in and possibly how to escape our cognitive biases and other items that might make us live less fully and perhaps less intelligently. So I feel a huge debt of gratitude to you, David.
Oh, thank you. That's incredible to hear.
We've studied extensively about how, and often for our survival and efficiency, the human brain is oriented toward making rather large mistakes in the form of cognitive biases. This is somewhat paradoxical because these biases were intended to help us survive, but oftentimes they actually can lead to us falling into perilous moments and worse. I'm wondering and I believe there are about 100 documented cognitive biases. I'm wondering which of these have seemed, from your perspective, to have the biggest detrimental effect on our human existence.
So right now, the thing that is sort of foundationally difficult for us to manage is confirmation bias. Of course,
that's going to.
And other sampling biases like survivorship bias and base rate fallacy and that kind of stuff. All of them are just a constellation that share traits with one another. Confirmation bias being the big one. And if for anyone, I'm sure most people are familiar with this at this point, but I think confirmation bias also gets misdefined or weirdly defined. But it comes down to it. You saw something happen, you experienced something, and you have an immediate hypothesis as to what that is. Then you go searching for evidence to confirm that your reaction to that is justified. That's the part that gets left out. I think the best way to look at it is, my old go-to on this is, you're in a tent in the woods, you hear a strange noise, you're scared, you get a negative affect in your body. You have no control over that. That just happens to you. You experience this feeling. And then you are compelled to justify your emotional reaction to the information that you just received. And you go out with your flashlight, maybe, and you might just sit there for a minute and go, let me see if I hear it again. But you go with your flashlight, and hopefully you'll find more evidence that will either give you a reason, will justify the feeling, or you can say, I don't have to feel that way anymore. And you come back. It could be a false positive, false negative. But in this scenario, this all seems to be working out the way it ought to. I think some of us feel that we hear like a bump in the night, like you hear like a weird sound. It's like, is that a murderer in my kitchen? And then we don't often get up and go look for it. We often stop and go, if I don't hear it again, I'll just go back to bed. So this is oddly social in the sense that you start looking for evidence to justify the anxiety that you just experienced. Well, why would you want to justify it? Because you're a social primate and you're imagining that I might have to defend the reasonableness of my behavior to my trusted peers if I go forward. I don't want to always seem trustworthy and I always seem like I'm a reasonable person to hang out with. So we do that in isolation all the time. The thing about it is now we have these incredible tools. So I can experience something that has happened. I can see a news story. That news story could create a negative affect in me. It could create a positive affect in me. It could ignite a prejudice, or it could ignite my desire to squash a prejudice. I'm going to have an emotional reaction to this new information that's coming in. And then if I go on a search to justify my response to that, I will find it. That's guaranteed now. You will find something online somewhere. You don't have to go to the library anymore. You don't have to get a magazine. You don't have to read a book. Let's go looking to see, is this justifiable reaction to it? And you're going to find it. And if you have
somewhere on the web,
you're going to, yeah. And if you don't have these rhetorical, critical thinking skill sets that you have to learn that don't necessarily come free with every copy of the brain, you might find, oh, wait, yeah, this is a totally reasonable thing to think and feel about this. And then not only that, this is something that we are now experiencing in the last 10 or so years. Look at all these other people that also did the same thing I just did. And they're already hanging out and talking about this. I should see what they're up to. And then now I'm hanging out with them every day. And since you're a social primate, you now are more motivated by being a good member of the group that you found yourself within than anything that motivated you to get into that group in the first place. And this step-by-step thing, the root of it is that pursuit of confirmation. And I love in psychology, there are sometimes these terms that are not very sexy or cool. It's called the make sense stopping rule. I love that. I go looking for information that will make sense of the thing that was ambiguous to me. And when I find it, I stop looking for more information right with the point where it seems like, oh, that makes sense. And so in our pursuit of disambiguating the ambiguous and turning the uncertainty into obviousness, we stop when we get the feeling that we've done it, when there may be way more research we should have done. That's why we had to invent the scientific method, because we'd rather confirm than disconfirm. There's a good reason for it. It was adaptive in previous environments. Now it gets into a lot of troubles. That's the one. That's the big one.
Yeah, it's rather buggy code for current times. And if I was to diagram it, as you mentioned, it's predicated upon our social brain's real and imagined audience. If there's an audience there, our attitudes shift. And even just by carrying around an imaginary audience, it would appear that we feel the need to justify it to this imaginary judge and jury of our peers.
Yeah, it's always left out.
Yeah.
I'll say one thing. I want you, don't lose your thought. I just want to throw in, I think Hugo Mercier told me, he's a cognitive psychologist. He said, confirmation bias makes sense if you look at it in a certain framework. He's like, if you lost your keys, you wouldn't go looking for them on Mars. You'd go looking for them in your kitchen. I want to confirm where I think they ought to be. That doesn't seem social at all. That seems just logical. Imagine if your roommate or your partner lost their keys and they bought a metal detector and started going around the neighbor's yard. You'd be like, what's wrong with you? We are tuned into, this seems like the more reasonable reaction. And reasonable is what seems defensible to other people as an action that you should pursue. Yeah, go ahead.
The knee-jerk response, which is a really bad one when we lose our keys, and I often bring this up as an example, is, wow, how could I be so stupid? And that is an imaginary audience in front of whom I'm completely self-flagellating. And I'm doing that in part because I must be better than that. And in front of that imaginary audience, I'm going to let them know that I am better than that by telling myself what an idiot I was for having lost my keys. Does it get me closer to finding my keys? Not at all. And yet it seems that the catalyst for this confirmation bias that can show up dictated by our social brains was for the sake of our survival and efficiency, which is rather paradoxical. You're right. It does help us narrow down the filter and not think about, well, they might be on Mars. But when we begin to actually engage in smarter thinking and think again and asking ourselves better questions, where might I have seen them last? Who else might I be able to call to ask if they know the whereabouts of my keys? But it seems that there is, within this confirmation bias, there is a sequence, a fairly predictable one. And it starts with information coming our way. We have a physiological response before we have a logical response. And based on that physiological response, it kind of dictates, this is what you do next. And it might be run out of the tent and look for what's making that terrible sound. It might be, if you're at home, not wanting to go in the kitchen to see if there might be a murderer, maybe putting the sheets over your head. But we are listening to the dictates of our physiological response And we are imagining, I imagine, on some level, the judge and jury evaluating our protocols at any given time. Like, are we behaving intelligently? And I'm sure for our survival, the evolution of these social brains make a lot of sense. And yet they don't work every time. In fact, they don't work a lot of the time. And one of the things that you illustrate in the book very well is a sequence of 3 numbers given out multiple times. Do you mind doing that for the audience so they can actually?
Oh, that's great. This is a great experiment by Peter Wason.
Okay.
Could be considered the father of the psychology of reasoning. I love telling audiences about this whenever I do lectures. So here's how it goes. The way it's typically framed is you're standing in front of an audience, and I ask everybody to raise their hands and lower your hands when you think you have figured out the secret rule that I'm using to pick out 3 numbers out of all the numbers in the universe. I'm using some rule that only I know. And when you think you figured out the rule, just lower your hands. So anyone listening, just imagine you've got your hand up. I do that so I can see in the audience how many people feel like they're already there yet. So 3 numbers, 2, 4, 6, right? If you think you've got the rule figured out at this point, lower your hand. And the next 10, 12, 14, and then 16, 18, 20. Okay. And at this point, if you haven't figured out my rule, I don't know what to tell you. It seems pretty obvious. The next thing I'd like you to do to demonstrate that you have discovered the secret rule I'm using, please give me 3 numbers using that rule. And dear audience member, actually do this. Say out loud right now, 3 numbers using the rule.
20, 22, 24. The conclusion.
That's great. People often say that. They often say 30, 32, 34. So what I will then say is, excellent.
And by the way, I can tell you how I came to that based upon this particular sequence. It's 2, 4, 6, 10, 12, 14, which the delta between the 2 and the 10 is 8. And then it shrunk to 6. And therefore, the delta between the 16, 18, and 20 should be 4 because it seems to go down by 2 each time. So 20, 22, 24 would be perhaps the logical conclusion based on that sequence.
Wow, that was great. Like you went 2 levels in. I love that.
And I would be totally certain that I got it right, by the way.
Yeah. You told me 3 numbers and I said, absolutely. That uses my rule. And what did you just get? Confirmation. You got confirmation. And that's what you were looking for. Because what you didn't do is give me 1, 2, 3.
Yep.
Or 3, 2, 1, which would potentially disconfirm your current assumption. And that's what we're compelled to do. We try to confirm first.
And yet that wouldn't be the right answer necessarily.
But the right answer is, I was just saying any 3 numbers in a row that one was bigger than the other. So, and that's the confirmation bias game.
I'm so mind blown by that. I've never heard that thought experiment. And it so beautifully illustrates confirmation bias because even though we were correct, we weren't entirely correct. And we weren't correct about the general rule. From this, we gleaned what we gleaned. And in fact, it could have been any of these, numbers that were sequenced in 3, and the first one was smaller than the second, and the third one was bigger than the third. And really dovetails so nicely with our desire to be perceived as smart by others and by ourselves. I want you to think I'm smart. I wanted you to hear my reasoning, even though it was incorrect.
Yeah. Smart is a subset of what you really want is to be as perceived as trustworthy.
Right. Socially credible.
And that reputation management in that domain is top of mind, whether or not that's salient for you, whether or not you ever articulate it. You're always at all times hoping other people consider you trustworthy. And you often will enter into situations where you kind of gauge what's trustworthy mean to this group of people. And let me calibrate to that. It's a big part of being a person. And even with confirmation bias, that's part of it, strangely.
And one of the things you also cite is that our fear of social death is greater than our fear of physical death. And it's so relevant to this conversation you and I are having right now about confirmation bias. Let's talk about social death versus physical death.
The great Brooke Harrington, I had reached out to her to ask her about all sorts of stuff. At that time, we were having conversations about anti-masking and anti-vaxxing in the middle of COVID. And she said to me, this thing will stick with me forever. And I made sure it got in the book. She said, if there was an E equals MC squared of social science, it would be the fear of social death is greater than the fear of physical death. And then my response to her was, are you saying that if the ship was going down, I'm going to put my reputation on the lifeboat and I'll go down with the ship? She was like, that's exactly what I'm saying. And we saw it very prominently with anti-masking and anti-vaxxing. Once that became politicized, and anything can become politicized. Volcanoes could become politicized. They just haven't yet. Anything can become, as Dan Kahan at the Cultural Cognition Lab, he kind of predicted it. He's like, electric cars could become, to his mind, that was like a neutral thing. He's like, electric cars could become politicized. And of course they are. Once something becomes a badge of loyalty or a mark of shame, and that can even be an idea, anything that could signal to your trusted peers that you are more or less trustworthy because of the way you are expressing an attitude, expressing an opinion, or merely adopting a behavior or not adopting a behavior, or just owning something or not owning it. Anything like that, that's politicization as much as the masks were. And as soon as that fell into that category, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask could create social sanctions, or it could give you social capital. And people, and this is tragic and it's awful, it's not laughable to me. And I've listened to audio of people on their deathbeds being very okay with this. I'm dying from this preventable illness, but I'm sticking to my values. I'm sticking to my attitudes on this issue. You shouldn't tell me to wear a mask. You shouldn't force me to take this vaccine. And that plays into, a very deep value structure and also a shared value structure with their peers that is far more motivating than the fear of their own death.
So you write about how minds change. And by the way, before we even get into that, what is the peanut butter and chocolate?
Okay, so like that example of confirmation bias, love it. There's other ones I love. There's an old experiment from the 70s where you listen to a day in the life of a woman named Jane, and it's very well crafted. Sometimes she does things that are kind of outgoing. Sometimes she does things that are very reserved. And they have a large group of people who hear that whole story. They come back 2 weeks later and you ask them, hey, Jane's thinking about becoming a real estate agent. Do you think she'd be good for that? And people who are wanting to give a good answer, they're motivated to give a good answer to the researcher. They say, they go in their own memories. They don't get to see the story again. They go back in their memories and remember all the times she seemed a bit extroverted. And they say, oh yeah, she's so extroverted. She should be great. And then they ask, well, she's also thinking about becoming a librarian. I know these are stereotypes, but that's how they said it in the 70s, is that she's also thinking about becoming a librarian. You think she'd be good for that? Well, now they've already stated this previous thing and they're going to stick with it. So they're like, oh no, she's too extroverted. But so that confirmatory search for an answer motivated by giving a response, once they had it, now they're in that like reputation defense mode of, I've given an answer. I don't want to seem, wishy-washy. What's great though, is that's just half of the people. The other half of the people, they brought them in just reverse order. They said, she's thinking about becoming a librarian. What do you think? And they'll say, oh yeah, she'd be a great librarian. She's so introverted. But she's also thinking about becoming a real estate agent. Oh no, she's too introverted for that. So you have these, what used to be one unified group of people who now have completely different answers to a question. And it's only because you asked it in a certain order. So now they're divided and they might even argue. She's extroverted. No, she's introverted. And all you had to do was give them a reason to search in a motivated way. And confirmation bias took care of the rest. So I used to use examples like this to demonstrate how flawed and irrational we are. There's all sorts of other things. So there were 10 years of pop science books that came out talking about how flawed and irrational we were, using these very easy to go to examples from research. Well, in the course of writing How Minds Change, I never intended this to be like one of these marketing phrases, but it ended up being kind of like that. Truly mean this. I changed my mind in the course of writing a book about how minds change because I had this cynical, pessimistic view of motivated reasoning. My favorite example of motivated reasoning is when a person's falling in love with someone, and you ask them, what do you like about that person? Why are you falling in love? They'll say something about the way they dress or the jokes they tell or the music they're introducing you to. And then if they're breaking up with that person and you ask, oh, why are you breaking up with them? They'll say, oh, the stupid jokes they tell, and the music I can't stand, the stuff they wear. So like reasons for become reasons against when the motivation to search for reasons to justify your attitude change. Oh, and my God. That's beautiful to me. And I was like, see, this is what we're doing at all times. And you scale it up to politics, bad things happen. So that was my mindset. And I remember a woman coming up to me after a lecture and telling me about how her father was in a conspiratorial quagmire, and she asked how to get him out of it. And at that time, many years ago, I said, there's nothing you could do. And I didn't feel, at the moment it came out of my mouth, I felt like, I don't know enough about this to tell you that. And I don't want to believe that's true, even saying it out loud. And maybe I shouldn't be doing that. So that was sort of an incepting moment. And then also at the same time, the attitudes about same-sex marriage in the United States flipped. If you weren't part of the activism, it felt like it happened overnight. Obviously, the activism had taken decades, but if you charted it out, the public opinion did flip over the course of 12 years and completely flipped over the course of 3. It went from being 60% opposed to being 60% in favor. And I was looking at that thinking, if you took every single one of those people who are in the majority now and put them in a time machine and sent them back 10 years, they would argue with themselves with the same vehemence people argue about wedge issues today. And that means that if their mind was going to change eventually, what was all that arguing about in the first place? And what happened in between those two moments? Because people look back upon themselves and think, Oh yeah, I was obviously wrong about that. So why wasn't it obviously wrong to you when you were wrong? And that became something I wanted to explore. And that led me to these peanut butter and chocolate thing I'm talking about. One's called the interactionist model and the other is called the truth wins scenario. I was very fortunate to meet Hugo Mercier, and in his work with Dan Sperber, they had created something called the interactionist model. And they have a credible amount of research, and they also go back through the old research, and it's a new way of framing a lot of the stuff that I've been writing about when it comes to motivated reasoning, confirmation bias included. And in short, they posit that we have two cognitive mechanisms for interacting with other people in the course of arguing and deliberating and sorting out shared goals and plans of action and so on. One system generates arguments and the other system evaluates arguments. Mm-hmm. And the system that generates arguments is biased and lazy, but it's not flawed and irrational. In fact, it's quite rational to come up with reasons for your behavior that your trusted peers will be okay with, because being shamed and ostracized is a bad thing for a social primate. It'll get you eaten. And it's not irrational to be biased. You're coming from your area of expertise, but that only makes sense if you're thinking that you're presenting it to your peers. So on that side of it, when we're evaluating, we're very careful. And they have a lot of great experiments where they trick people into creating arguments for things, and then they present the arguments back to them. When you're tricked into thinking it's somebody else's argument, you'll find all the flaws in it. But when you know it's yours, those suddenly become invisible. You defend it. And that's been taken even further now recently with researchers using VR. They have people walk into a room and Freud's sitting there. And you sit down in front of Freud and Freud asks you, tell me what your problems are right now. And you tell them the problem you have currently that you can't seem to work out. Then it reboots. And now you are Freud. And they've recorded everything you did, including your body. And you have an avatar of your face. And you sit down in front of yourself and you hear yourself tell yourself the problem you're working on. They have a 58% success rate in people having breakthrough because they leave the argument production frame and they go into the argument evaluation frame, where it's much more clear what you should say. They call it the Solomon effect, where people are really good at giving people advice on problems that they themselves can't seem to follow. Mm-hmm. So that's all plays into the interactionist model. So seeing it as reasoning is biased and lazy is different, because if you're trying to decide where you want to go for dinner, as a very simple example, you save a lot of cognitive labor by just coming up with the weakest argument possible. Like, I want to go here because I like this. If you ask somebody, where do you want to go to dinner? It's much easier for them to say, this is where I want to go. And then on the evaluation side, people can start picking it apart. I don't want to go there because I have an ex that works there. I don't want to go there because I had that last week. This scales up. Like, you can be talking about whether or not you want to engage in a land war. And somebody says, well, this is a good reason to do it. And so it's like a 12 Angry Men type thing. So that's one side of it. And then the other side of it is this truth win scenario. This is from Tom Stafford, the cognitive psychologist who is working in this domain right now. And he urged me to see that almost all of the research into things like confirmation bias, even things in the sort of thinking fast and slow world, a lot of that research was done on individuals in isolation. And you can take some of those things, or all of them so far, really. And when people commit like sunk cost things and the Wason selection task and those sorts of things, these are experiments that demonstrate very reliably how people have problems with reasoning through probabilities and things. It can make people seem very irrational and flawed. But if you take those same studies and give people a chance to deliberate in a group, what usually happens is, I have a great example of this. There's something in psychology called the cognitive reflection task. It's part of the thinking fast and slow world. The intuitive response that people come to very quickly, people very reliably come up with a bad answer. And here's an example. If it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? I'm not going to give you the answer to this. This is something for the audience to play with. But I want you to know that Tom Stafford gave this to me, and now I'm using this in lectures, where what is great about this is if you ask people this in isolation, more than half the people usually will get it wrong in isolation. Or if you give the entire cognitive reflection task, everybody at least gets one of these wrong. I like to ask this in front of an audience. And what I say is, if anybody has the right answer, and you know you have the right answer, like, raise your hand. And then they'll raise their hand and they'll say, the answer is 5 minutes. They don't say, give me your reasoning. Everybody says it a little differently, but they'll explain what's going on there. And when they explain it, you get the whole audience to be like, oh. And what you see in action here is, in isolation, if you took everybody's answers and you mushed them together and said, human beings as a group in total are very irrational, very bad at this.
Human beings are very irrational is a massive finding by 2 Nobel Prize-winning social scientists, Danny Kahneman, I believe Amos Tversky maybe posthumously won it as well, but I'm not sure if Tversky got it. But for sure, Kahneman so much of his work is predicated upon the idea that we believe ourselves to be super rational because many of our thought processes are quite rational. It's just that the conclusions that we've come to that precede the thought process. And it's ironic that the conclusion came first and then we back it up with rational thought, which kind of makes sense, except it's wrong.
What is great about that is they're right, of course. In isolation, working alone, we have these problems. But if you just put people in a group like this, when one person stands up and not only says the answer, but they tell you how they arrived at it, we evaluate that and go, that's the right answer. And all of a sudden, you have a group of people who are majority incorrect flipped to every single person who got the right
Totally.
answer.
And everybody gets it and everybody sees it.
And Tom Stafford calls that the truth wins scenario. And he's playing around right now with trying to get platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on to be more amenable to this. Because currently they favor the individual reasoning side of things and not so much the group reasoning side of things. So the argument production, not an argument evaluation. So I consider that sort of the peanut butter and chocolate that got me going, my comeuppance, because I was wrong in both ways. I was looking at people in isolation. I didn't really realize I was doing that. And I wasn't thinking about this interactionist model where, oh, it does make sense for us to do that in isolation, but we clearly evolved to work these things out in groups. And when I go to argue with somebody or debate something with somebody, if I keep that in mind, it makes it so much easier to go shoulder to shoulder and Venn diagram with the other person with all that in mind. So I just wanted to say all that out loud as sort of fundamental to how the book got put together.
And, and that's such a strength of our social brain that you're speaking to on the opposite end of how our brains, as we try to muddle through things with either similar minded people or perhaps on our own, might be misguiding. That oftentimes when we collaborate kind of an open source fashion, almost like 12 jurors coming together, conferring, and allowing the best idea to win, we usually come to the right answer if we leave our egos at the door and really, really try to go for the best answer. I find myself also thinking about this. Levy's an Israeli social scientist who gave a TED Talk and asked everybody in the audience who had electronic devices to estimate the weight of an elephant. And individually, there was a broad disparity between the estimations of the weight, but collectively, they were off by just a couple pounds. And it's funny, I guess that kind of in some ways may even negate, but maybe, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I love that. Like, let's imagine we're three proto-humans on a hill looking in different directions. And what we need is a worldview, because you're looking this way, you're looking this way, you're looking this way. I can't see what you see, you can't see what I see. Well, that worldview is only going to work well if I have trust in you, but also I'm aware of the fact you could be wrong. I trust you enough that I think you're not misleading me, but you could just be wrong. And then you have different experiences than I have. If we're thinking maybe we should go into this area of the woods and you went there and you got attacked by a bear, and then my friend over here has never been there before and has never been attacked by a bear. In fact, they never left the village or whatever. This person's going to say, I don't think we should go there. And this other person's going to say, I think that we should go there right now. Like, these are biased, lazy arguments being produced by that person through their own lenses of confirmation. And they're chasing the emotion and then justifying it afterwards. To me, that makes total sense now. That's how useful this now becomes, because we need to bang our heads together for this collective action. And I know from experience, like after a tornado or a hurricane, you enter into that chaotic information, that epistemic chaos of rumors become valuable again. And I start modulating whether or not I should take action by how much I trust the person giving me the information. Part of the trust is, are they out to trick me? And the other thing is this person even have any expertise in the matter? Like, how could they know that? And one of the weird things about joining the newness of exchanging information on the internet and social media has been a return to a chaotic epistemic space where we are having to modulate by trust so much and modulate by, do you have expertise? Are you a person of high enough reputation and status that I should pay attention to what you're saying? And it starts to feel like, oh no, we're in post-truth world, but it really isn't that. It's hard for me to determine trust. And I'm now in a situation where trust seems to be important world. And that leads to a lot of our most intractable things, because I want to work with you. I want to sort this out and deliberate, but I don't want to sort this out and deliberate with a person who really doesn't have my values or my best interest in mind. And that becomes very motivating as to whether or not we accept any information at all and whether or not we consider certain things confirming or disconfirming.
So, one of the biggest pieces is a little bit heartbreaking to read about our species is that we believe ourselves to be very reasonable and perhaps even persuadable by data. And it turns out that if you want to change someone's mind, throwing a ton of data is not necessarily going to work. In fact, it might actually get them to be more polarized. So I'm just wondering if you'd speak to that paradox as well as what we could do instead. So let's talk about data dumps, why they may be misguided, even though all of us would say, show me the data and I'll change my mind. Turns out not so much.
It's pretty easy. Just pretend you're having an argument with a flat earther right now. This is a nice neutral group of people. Spent time with them. And let's say you're having an argument with a flat earther on the internet and they say, here, let me send you some links. Here, let me send you some YouTube videos. First of all, are you going to click those links? Are you going to watch that YouTube video? If you do watch that YouTube video, because I know I've watched so many, like about 2 minutes in, you're like, okay. So let me work this up foundationally, why facts are such an issue. First caveat, in a good faith environment, we're all playing by the same rules. Facts are great. If you're in a place where you're like, let's gather evidence, the evidence let's put a bunch of hypotheses out there. The one that has the most evidence is the one that we're going to go with for now until we get more information. Every model we create can be changed, thrown away. There are plenty of spaces where we've generated that. Law, academia, science, medicine. But those were all structures we had to invent. And those are all almost like pilot's checklists to keep us from doing what we innately have proclivities toward. They're what we call good faith argumentation environments. So facts are great in those spaces. Outside of those spaces where most of us spend most of our time, we have to deal with the way brains update. Brains update via assimilation and accommodation. This is Jean Piaget stuff. I've got his great book over here, The Principles of Genetic Epistemology. Yep. Anyone who's a nerd in this world or has to ever teach anything or be a professional who thinks about brains, you got to make sure this is in your foundation. It's similar to the paradigm shift stuff of Thomas Kuhn. The idea being, say a child encounters a dog for the first time, but doesn't have a word for it yet. They point at it and you say, look, dog. Something sort of categorical takes place in the mind. We could assume they're thinking non-human, walks on four legs, furry, wagtail, dog. Okay. Later on, they see a horse for the first time and they point and say dog. And if they're like a really clever child, they might be like big dog. And that's assimilation. That's an attempt to, you have a model, you have a category, you see something ambiguous and uncertain and unfamiliar, and you interpret it as another version of what you already understand. You interpret it as almost as confirmation that you understand the world already. It's a way to fit something out there that's new into an existing model. When you say, no, that's not a dog, that's a horse, the child has to do something along the lines of, I now have to create a new category in which both horses and dogs fit. And I have to expand my mind. Or as Piaget would say, I have to accommodate this. Now I have a new category. You might even get a name for it, creature or animal. And we're doing this at all times. In this conversation, everything we ever experience, assimilation and accommodation is happening all the time. They're both ways the mind changes. One of them is sort of strengthening what you already understand, nuancing it. And the other is saying, okay, this is an anomaly or a new bit of information that suggests my model's incomplete or incorrect. I need to accommodate for that. I spoke to Michael Russell about this once. He said, like, imagine you open the door to your house and there's like a full-on marching band. I think he went even further, like, what if it's a bunch of snakes in a marching band going around your living room? At first, you would be like, okay, this is a trick, accidentally ate acid somewhere, or this is a hologram, or I don't know. You try to fit it into your current understanding of how the world works. You don't immediately leap to, oh, I guess snakes can do that. And so we're always doing that. Assimilation is disambiguating the ambiguous by interpreting it as evidence for what you already understand. And then accommodation is acknowledging that your model is incomplete or incorrect. You do that enough, and you start to have a pretty robust model. And we walk, I call a tightrope of adaptiveness here, where you're always going to resist change until you have to, because if you update when you shouldn't, that's dangerous. But there's a risk reward there, because if you don't update when you should, that's also dangerous. So becoming wrong is dangerous. Staying wrong is dangerous. So you update your mind carefully, erring more on assimilation, because it's more likely that it's gotten you this far. So it's probably useful. So already we have some resistance, but then that resistance, it's stronger and stronger when other motivations come into play, which would be things like social sanctions. There are all sorts of motivations that will lead you to favor assimilation over accommodation even more strongly. A lot of conspiratorial thinking goes this way. Every time the false flag thing comes around, that's a real good example. Like I remember when the
false flag thing.
I remember during the insurrection, the January 6th thing, there were a lot of Trump supporters or QAnon supporters who were like, oh, well, that just wasn't Trump supporters. Those were actors. That was like secret agents pretending to be people.
Right. It might be Antifa or something like that.
In my group, right? Antifa. Yeah. That was what's going on there? Well, I have a really strong attitude and value that goes along with it. That is, I am in a group of people who supports this candidate, and that's good. It's good to do that. I'm in the right group. Then you see this thing happen that really is against your values. Like, you shouldn't do that. It's a bad thing that's happening. And you have that cognitive dissonance boil up where you're like, I have one attitude that says I'm in the right group and it's a good group. And I see members of my group doing a bad thing. The easiest way out of this, instead of accommodating, which would require you to expand your understanding of the matter and say, well, maybe some of the people in my group are doing bad things, and maybe some of the things that we're doing are bad. And maybe this is more nuanced than I thought before. I need to update. It's easier to just not update and interpret this as more evidence that you're still right and say, well, that just wasn't members of my group. It was somebody else.
Right.
And that's why the false flag is the easy way out of cognitive dissonance. So we're always doing this at all times. And what happens, it's not salient. It's often invisible. It happens underneath the radar. It happens subconsciously or non-consciously. And when you disagree with someone on an issue, since so much of this is non-conscious and it comes from all of your nature and nurture and all of your motivations to be a good member of this group or the other, and the thousands of other things that lead up to the drives and motivations that get you into a certain emotional state when you encounter new information, often what happens is it'll be invisible to you that, let's say you're talking about gun control or immigration or the earth being flat around, that you have on your own went into all the dense pockets of information available to you, and you've cherry picked that which seemed to comport with your attitudes and your beliefs and your values. And you have done that so much that the things that seem like facts to you are those things that justify and support the way you feel about the issue.
Yep.
And when you encounter someone who disagrees, it feels like what I'm going to do here is to take all these things which are facts and dump them on the other person, because if they had just seen what I'd seen, they'd feel the way I feel. How could they see it otherwise?
We build higher on a faulty foundation.
It's so good.
Essentially.
So good.
And I'm thinking about my own process with Lance Armstrong. I loved Lance Armstrong. He was my very favorite athlete of all time. No one even came close. I read up on him. I was really into him. And I was absolutely recalcitrant. I was positive he was being wrongly framed. I was in that ilk. And then one day I was disabused of that. Same thing even with O.J. Simpson at the very beginning. I was like, there's no way he could have done that. He's my beloved O.J. from the Hertz commercials and amazing on the football field. I love this guy. He was in the Naked Gun. I had a relationship with O.J. This was not something I could accommodate. And you're speaking of Piaget's work so beautifully around the assimilation versus accommodation too. It's funny, they were kind of part of graduate school, but they weren't things that we really got geeked out to nearly as much as we need to, as evidenced by the way that you're talking about the implications of assimilation accommodation. If I were to give kind of another subtitle to your book, it would be called Maximizing Where We're Smart and Shrinking Where We're Dumb. And, and I'm wondering, what would be your advice to the world if you had magical powers that were conferred upon you that would allow us to maximize our inherent intelligence that are perhaps even dictated by our biases, and to minimize our inherited biases that actually lead us to really bad decisions?
Sure.
What would be your formulation? What would be your prescription?
There's another idea in psychology called elaboration. We can talk about it very simply. If I'm trying to sell you a bar of soap and I tell you, you should buy this bar of soap because it'll make your hands smell like flowers. Elaboration. Some person is going to hear that and go, oh, I love flowers. I want my hands to smell like flowers. Thank you. I'm buying it. And then another person will say, I don't want my hands to smell like flowers. So it persuades one person and dissuades the other. And this is what I'm talking about. Like, the facts don't speak for themselves. Something always speaks on behalf of them. And elaboration is usually what that is. That's a person adding their own thing to the information you gave them. And in an argument space, I can imagine me telling someone, oh, you should buy the soap. I love it. It's the best soap. It'll make your hands smell like flowers. I think it's easy to understand elaboration that way.
It was a perfect narrative, by the way.
That seems obvious in that domain. Doesn't seem so obvious when we get stuck in these deeply political, social structure things. I start telling you things about gun control that I feel like should change your mind. I'm like, this fact, this fact, this fact. And the other person's like, that doesn't persuade me at all.
It's the opposite of what I would want.
It's lost on you that would be an obvious reason for it to feel the way you feel.
Totally.
So what you're missing out on here is something called cognitive empathy. And you're under the spell of something called naive realism. Everything we just talked about falls under naive realism. The great Lee Ross came up with that. You can't copy and paste your reasoning in the other person. You're starting at conclusions that you reached through a process that you are maybe are aware that you even engaged in. And you're asking them to just take it and go, thank you. That makes sense to me. They have to go through that same process through their value sets, their attitudes, their experiences, their social concerns, and their reasoning has to reach some place where you can both agree. And you can't just copy and paste the way you got there into the other person. They have to get there. And the best conversational techniques take all of this into account. So a good friend of mine, Will Storr, he writes great books. I regularly recommend them. He said, ask yourself, am I right about everything? Now, this could be in total, or it could just be about this one particular issue we're talking about. Ask yourself, am I right about everything? Now, if the answer is yes, just go into politics. But if the answer is no, well, no, I'm not right about everything. I couldn't possibly be. Then ask yourself, what am I wrong about?
Oof.
And then if the answer is, well, I don't know, because as Karen Schultz said, until you know you're wrong, it just feels like you're right. So if you knew what you were wrong about, instantly become right about it. You know you were wrong about it.
Yeah.
So if you ask yourself, am I right about everything? No. Then what am I wrong about? I don't know. Now ask, why don't I know what I'm wrong about? And what could I do about that? So this is the way to reach that state of,
why don't I know what I'm wrong about? And what can I do to know more?
I know it's strange. It feels weird that we don't do this all the time, but you can think about any issue. If we're having the abortion debate, I don't care which side you're on that. Have you done this? Have you asked yourself, am I right about everything when it comes to this issue?
Yeah.
There's no way I could be. Well, then what am I wrong about? I have no idea. How come? And what can I do about that? So any issue, whether it's fact-based or it's attitude or it's value-based, climate change is a good example. I can be very confident that climate change is real and caused by humans, but I do have to admit to myself that I am not a climate scientist, and everything I know about this is received wisdom. And it would take a lot of effort to go. I'd have to go to Antarctica and get core samples to really feel like I had enough expertise to get on stage and debate it with somebody, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm just going to have to depend on experts that I trust. And why do I trust them? And the blah, blah, blah. And the same is true for the other party. I like starting there because if you can do that for yourself, then you can offer it to the other person too. And that's where you start. You start by generating a type of rapport where I suggest, I'm wondering, what are we wrong about here? What are we not seeing? I agree this is an important issue. I think you're irrational and you're an intelligent person, and we both care. We want to solve the problems in the world.
And by the way, I just want for the listener to hear, he said irrational, not irrational.
Yeah. You are
irrational.
Rational, intelligent, considerate. You seem like you care about this issue a lot. And we both agree that there are problems in the world. And I'm wondering on this issue, though, fascinates me that we disagree on it. I wonder if we could be okay with exploring that. Like, I would like to know why we disagree. Notice the difference between this and saying, I want to win, I want you to lose. I want to show you how I'm right and you're wrong. Instead, I'm saying, it's fascinating that we disagree on this. I'd like to figure out why. I wonder if we could collaborate, and instead of being face to face and arguing, what if we went shoulder to shoulder and looked at the problem together and marveled at the fact that we have two different perspectives? And I wonder what's going on there. If you open with that, the success rate on this, in the book, I spend time with deep canvassing, street epistemology, smart politics, motivational interviewing. All these frameworks use the same idea of, what if we entered into a partnership? Let's try to solve the mystery together. And the mystery is, why do we disagree? The mystery isn't, why am I right and you're wrong? It's, why do we disagree? And then there's a great trick that comes after that. This comes straight out of motivational interviewing. If it's a fact-based issue, you ask for a very specific claim. If it's an attitude-based issue, you want to ask how somebody feels about the issue. And you try to put it onto a number scale. So if it's like, is the earth round or flat? How do you feel? I think it's flat. If you were to tell me, like, what's your level of certainty on that from 0 to 10 or 1 to 100? Get a number in there. And then, or if I'm asking you, let's say it's an attitude thing, like, do you think gun control should be tighter or looser in the United States? Now you say, like, on a scale, like the tight would be, if you even look at a gun, you go to jail. And then loose is, everybody gets a gun in the mail every month. No questions asked. Like, where would you put yourself? I would say
right.
That's 0 to 10 on that. Either way, you get that number scale. This comes out of motivational interviewing, where now I've taken it even more out of that binary win, lose, right, wrong place. And I'm starting to open up a space where I'm going to non-judgmentally listen to you and give you a chance to metacognate and get in there. And this is whatever number they give you. You can do this with yourself with a movie to feel it. Like the last movie you watched, let's say it was Top Gun Maverick. Did you like it? Okay, well, what would you give it on a like scale of 0 to 10? And I love when you ask people the questions like this, because they often do the, you're witnessing them shift. You're witnessing metacognitions kick in, because you're like, it's so easy to feel the feeling, but it's hard. Now I'm like, I need to justify it. I need to explain it. I need to rationalize it. And I need to sound reasonable to the person I'm talking to.
Exactly. Remain credible.
So you're like,
my reputation may stay in the lifeboat, but I'm going down with this boat.
That's right. So you're like 0 to 10. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd give it like an 8, maybe 7. Let me give it a 7. And then you can ask anything we're talking about. Why a 7? What does that feel like a right number to you? I'm going to ask you to go even deeper. I love when people do that. They're like, well, you know, this and then that, and there's this and there's that. And then motivation interviewing came out of people coming for help for alcoholism and then drug abuse. Oftentimes, therapists noticed that people would leave those sessions more likely to engage in the behavior than when they came in. That was because they were generating reactance in the other person by telling them what they ought to think and feel. When a person feels like someone's saying, I want you to think this, people will very quickly go, you can't just tell me what to think. And reactance will push them away. So they would generate counter arguments for the therapist's position, and they'd walk away with new counter arguments that they didn't have before that lead them to do the behavior more than if they came in. Same thing can happen. And we do this all the time when we argue with people online. On Top Gun Maverick, if they say they're a 7, you can say, why didn't you give it a 9? Why not a 9? And a person will now be tasked with generating arguments for not being that extreme on the thing, which will oftentimes get them to naturally go a little bit lower on the scale after they've heard themselves speak. So this is the beginning of all these techniques, is that I've established rapport. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to ostracize you. There's no risk of you being looked poorly upon by your group. I'm not going to judge you poorly. I just want to discuss this issue with you and investigate it and marvel at why we could see it differently and wonder why 2 people could see it differently. Then get the claim or get the attitude out there and then get it on a number scale to get out of argument place into metacognition place, and then open space for the person to introspect and ask them to possibly form their first real opinion about the issue by saying, where are you on the number scale? Why is that a good number for you? And then why are you not other places on the scale? And then all the techniques go further from that after.
Yeah. And once they feel into the dissonance between the numbers, they're able to have a more nuanced conversation about the thing that they may have otherwise been recalcitrant around, use that word again. Dave, we're getting to the end of our time. And one of the things I'm just sitting in great appreciation of is, you know, having spoken with you offline and reading your book and now hearing you during the course of this interview, you seem to be the embodiment of cognitive flexibility. You came from, as you said, a trailer in Mississippi, and you've spoken in the halls of Harvard and had all the experiences in between. And you've decided to take on how we think and to ask yourself, how can I be better next year? And how can my future self perhaps evolve and become over time? And I'm just sitting in great appreciation of that. I'm also finding myself thinking about 2 great quotes that really relate. One from, I believe it came from Rabbi Nachman, who existed probably in the 18th century. He said something akin to, there's no purpose for next year if you don't plan on improving. And Maya Angelou once said, do the best you can. And when you know better, do better. And you seem to be really, really rocking those traits. And I'm just so grateful for your contributions to my field in psychology and how much the readers of your books are going to benefit, and that will become hopefully a more collaborative, thoughtful society. Perhaps just last month I was in Africa and I saw the detrimental effects of what happens when divide and conquer occurs out in nature. And one of the things that we need more than ever is the capacity to unite. And to borrow from a previous guest as well, some thing that you were speaking to, and that is our ability to externalize a problem and to co-solve it together as if we were working on a puzzle. So I just want to thank you for your time and for contributing to solving some of the bugs within our software that could cause us to lead less full lives, and just beyond grateful to you, man.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.